Hey guys, it's Micah. Welcome to another Philosophical Tuesday. Thank you for joining us as we, quote, insert idiom here, unquote. In today's podcast, we explore the topic of justice. What is justice? What is the difference between moral justice and legal justice? Does justice lie more in actions or in general principles? Is justice objective? What are the requirements of its objectivity? These are a few of the questions we explore. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to another episode of another Philosophical Tuesday. It's been so long since we recorded this, I almost forgot the name of the podcast. I am your host, Micah Young. I am here with the beautiful, the wonderful, and the amazing microphone of Josh. I didn't even specify which Josh, but we're gonna do. Hi, Josh Charles.
Hi, Micah. I'm honored that you chose me first.
Well, I actually chose your microphone first, so I can't even see your microphone.
No, you can't. But you know, I feel very honored. Even if you didn't intend to honor me, I will accept honor anyway. As the first and foremost of the two Joshes.
To be mentioned.
Firstborn, first everything. Micah, it's good to see you. I'm here with the ever beautiful, and we can no longer comment about his hair, so I won't even mention it. But the just beautiful and really has no other qualities to mention, Josh Smith.
Why, thanks, Josh. And my life motto is the first shall be last and the last shall be first, so I am the first after all, the first Josh.
But then when you be the last?
And it's a never-ending cycle.
It's okay.
So I'm both.
I'm gonna have a stroke now because of that.
I am. I'm the last and the first. Well, I'm here with our host Micah Young, who already introduced himself.
I did introduce myself. I'm just that important. I get introduced twice.
Yeah, what an introduction that was.
Now we should just start a never-ending cycle of introductions.
It's okay.
Maybe you could introduce me first this time.
Charlton, have you yet been convinced? Has Smith yet convinced you that you don't exist? I feel like at one point he was trying to convince you of that.
You know, we really ought to pick up that. I actually want to make that a podcast episode. I want a whole podcast dedicated to Josh trying to convince me that I don't exist. Because I don't think we ever resolved that.
Okay, well, you guys, think about that. Smith, you, think about that, while you're out
I'm not
doing
good at
your
convincing
stuff.
people. I'm good at asking questions that make them doubt their own existence, but I can't convince him, with logic.
Well, let's get into the topic for the day. Hopefully, we'll get there at some point. So today we're going to be talking about justice. What is it? Is sort of the starting point. I think we can go off of thinking about justice specifically. We can think about justice in a legal sense. We can talk about it in the sense of, some of the modern uses of the term, such as social justice. We can talk about justice versus fairness, justice versus rights, how all those things interact. So I guess the best way to start off would be by trying to define it. So does anybody have a good idea of something that we can, to get us started there? What is a good definition of justice?
I've never had a good idea.
I think maybe one quality is a balancing, like a weighing of the scales and equalizing them out.
So, okay, that's imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, what are you weighing out the scales of? What are you balancing out?
I would say you're balancing out the scales of Yeah, it's difficult.
I would just define it as people getting what they deserve.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say consequences that are commensurate with the actions you commit.
Okay.
Maybe that's worse than Josh's definition.
No. I mean,
It's a fancy way of saying it, but I think it's the same.
Yeah, you guys are both.
I think it's the
thing.
balancing of the two ideas: the consequences and the actions. And so maybe there's something there.
Okay, so it's a right correspondence between the actions someone takes and the consequences that are handed out. But it can't be quite that simple, because in order for, if you think about a legal system, okay? A legal system exists. A court, you have a magistrate, you have a court system. You have people who are responsible for handling situations where justice has not actually been done, where somebody has done something and has not received consequences commensurate their actions, may have received consequences that are actually opposite of what they should have received for their actions. So, somebody steals something and gains wealth, even though it is illegal, and we can separately say morally wrong. We talk about moral justice and legal justice. It's illegal and morally wrong to do so, yet they have gained from this. When justice corrects that, how I guess what I'm trying to think through is how does justice correct that system? Because if justice is getting what you deserve, if justice is getting the consequence that are due you commensurate your actions, what happens when somebody has been wronged and justice is dealt out to the person who wronged them, but the person who was wronged was still wronged? Nothing can change that. If somebody murders somebody and justice is done to the murderer, has justice been done for the murdered?
Well, I don't think justice is intended to, at least if we're talking about it in a sort of legal sense, but I think even in a moral sense, when we talk about justice, we're not talking about the victim, per se. We're talking about the perpetrator. So you as an individual have justice for your individual actions. If you have acted, and justice could be you could say positive or negative. So if you have acted in a way that is good and moral, and that is rewarded, that is justice. Simultaneously, if you act in a way that is bad and immoral, and that is punished, that is also justice. Justice is only framed in that context. I don't think that when we talk about, an individual having something happen to them, that you could rightfully claim, if I'm victimized in some way, be it by anything that's outside of my own control, outside of my own actions. So you might say it is a pathetic circumstance in which I am robbed, or I am injured, or even something not by another human being. Maybe just a tree falls through my house during a bad storm. This is a bad thing that has happened to me that I have not. There's no action on my part that has resulted in this. It's just something that has happened to me. There is no just response for me because there's no action that took place. I would argue that justice cannot exist absent the action, because definitionally, at least according to how I would define justice, it is basically you get what you deserve for the action that you did. So if there's no action, there's no justice to be had one way or the other.
Okay, so, can I respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I basically agree that you can't have justice without an action. I think that Micah kind of brought up the two different sides of justice. So there's the moral justice and there's the legal justice. When it comes to someone committing a wrong action against another person, the injustice is the immoral action, and so the righting of the wrong will be the enacting of justice on a moral, personal level. So in kind of trying to make up for the bad thing that he did, this person will be kind of righting the wrong. On a legal level, whatever court system or whoever is trying to rectify the situation between the two parties. So if I steal from someone, I am required by law, or at least within a lot of traditional legal settings, you are required by law to give back the number of like things that you stole from them. In like biblical times, you were required to give back to them tenfold if you stole from them. And that was justice in the eyes of their society on a legal level. So I think there is the distinction between the two. But I think there is also a sense in which retribution has to be a part of justice.
I don't quite see. I guess I don't quite see the difference here. And in the sense that the fundamentals, I don't really see as altering between these two circumstances. This idea of the moral justice or the legal justice. I mean, and legal justice is difficult to talk about because you have to assume that, first of all, you have to eventually get into specifics of individual legal systems, and you have to assume that those legal systems are acting with a desire to enact justice, which I would certainly argue that many legal systems actually don't. For example, our own legal system tends to favor. There is certainly an element of justice to ours, but more and more there's kind of a push for our legal system to focus more upon rehabilitation of the offender. So rather than just kind of punishment, rather than pure justice, it's actually more focused around mercy towards the perpetrator than it is towards justice, which is worth noting because that's not actually. There are actually different motivations at play there.
I would challenge you on that. I don't know that the legal system is designed around that. I think it certainly operates that way. I think our modern legal system in the United States operates that way a lot. I don't think that's the way that the legal system is designed.
I'm not saying design in particular. I'm more saying that when it comes to talking about a legal system, if it gets a little tricky because you do have to start worrying about some of the specifics. Right, and you know, it obviously the reason, theoretically at least, the reason why it is we implement legal systems to begin with is to pursue justice, right? But that's not always in the specific example upheld. There may be other motivations at play aside from kind of raw pursuit of justice that actually lead to justice not being done. And that's all I'm saying by that. I'm not saying that the legal system's reason for existing stops being justice. Rather that there are potentially other motivations that are coming into play, at least in more modern
And that's
times.
going to be the difficulty here because the legal system is going to be a lot more arbitrary in terms of its justice.
Right.
The justice there is more of a subjective, like, defined by the collective of a society.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is that we ought not to restrain our conversation to justice to the legal system because the legal system is not. It is a mistake to make a 1v1 correlation between justice and the legal system. So I would rather focus our conversation around justice in the kind of moral sense of the word, than in any kind of particular legal system, because I think there's just too much in the weeds there. And there's too many other motivations at play to just have to focus a conversation around the idea of justice.
Okay.
To focus that conversation around the legal.
There might be some helpful precedents though in things such as like the Roman legal tradition, which was the very basis for modern Western law, which said that it's better for 100 guilty men to walk free than for one innocent person to be condemned guilty, and that's why we have the whole innocent before proven guilty thing.
And we can certainly make reference to that and talk about that. That's all. I'm just kind of trying to draw the conversation around a more moral sense of the word and that to me would be a conversation around the moral sense, right? We're not focusing that around the legal sense of that. We're focusing around the moral sense of that. Is that a morally correct statement? Do we believe that? I guess that's what I'm trying to focus the conversation.
So then let's start the conversation by talking about what justice means morally in terms of moral justice. And then once we wrap that up, maybe we can start to at least explore a little bit the idea of what it means for a legal system to pursue some sort of implementation of moral justice and how that interacts with the idea of a social contract and the fact that just because a law has been broken doesn't mean that you've committed a moral injustice outside of that law, that sort of thing. But starting with the idea of, again, what is justice in just kind of in a basic philosophical sense in terms of something has some moral imbalance has been committed, some wrong has been committed, some sin has been committed, and justice is what in response to that?
I think we've already to some extent touched on this, which is just that, and I think, rather than try to complicate things, I think that really basic understanding of justice, that justice is you get what you deserve. I think that is probably a really good foundation to build off of for that. I think we could complicate it, but I would rather narrow to that base definition and then build around that than try to develop a more complicated. I think we could get caught in the weeds on this if we're not careful.
Okay. So we've said that justice is getting what you deserve for the actions that you have committed. We've also sort of played with the idea that justice is a response not to inaction, typically, but to action. Do we want to move forward with that? Do we want to explore that a little bit more? Is there anything, I guess an unresolved question from earlier, is there any sense in which justice is about something that happens to somebody, or is it entirely about an action that somebody takes? So it's not just consequences for your actions.
I would say to that, generally speaking, the issue there is more fairness rather than justice. So if a tree falls on your house, and this doesn't happen to really anybody, but it happens to you, that's unfair. Right. But it's not unjust, because it wasn't, first of all, it wasn't personal. It wasn't something personally designated to do something to you. It's a bit of a different scenario when someone specifically targets you because that person is committing an act of injustice, which is in some way like tearing you down as a person. And in that sense, I think we could get into to what extent that's injustice.
I mean, you might say that in the event that, I think, right, in the event of like a tree, right, falls on your house or breaks your back or something like that, that's just might not be fair, like Josh said, but that's not injustice. You might say that an injustice has been done upon you by another human being coming and robbing you. And so in that sense, you could say that, yes, justice is in that sense related to the victim rather than the victimizer. But that doesn't really change the fundamental definition per se.
No, it doesn't. And in fact, if you're going to place such an emphasis on the personal harm that comes about as a result of someone doing something to you and making that about justice, then you would have to apply that to actions you commit against yourself. So if you're being reckless and you're driving your car and you get in a car crash, did you commit injustice against yourself?
Yeah. And here's another question. If we were to frame the conversation of justice around the victim rather than the action of the perpetrator, then we have to start taking into account things like to what extent did that action actually harm the perpetrator. So, for example, if I rob $1,000 from somebody, and that somebody is very, very poor, and I've just stolen half of all that they own, or that person is very, very rich, and I've just stolen what to them is basically nothing, does that actually really change the evilness of the action? Can we actually say that?
That's a really good question.
Or is the action itself...
Sorry to interrupt.
No, go.
That's a really good question because, remember, I mentioned justice being the balancing of the scales. And if you're stealing from the rich person, you're probably balancing the scales a bit. And if you're stealing from the poor person, you're definitely not balancing the scales because you're making the poor person poorer.
I don't think we could rightfully call that justice. That might be what people are commonly referred to as social justice, which is a completely different thing. And so I guess that's kind of the point, right? If we start to consider justice in terms of the victim rather than the action of the perpetrator, we start getting into some really dicey territory where all of a sudden we're talking about an individual being punished more or less based on how much we perceive the victim as having deserved the injustice being done upon them.
Well, and then
which is really dicey territory.
And we start to conflate justice directly with fairness, which we've already made an important distinction between. And people have their own definition of what fairness is. Is fairness equity or is fairness equality? And that's where you start to get to the idea of social justice. Well, I didn't start out with all the same things in life that XYZ person over here did. That is unfair to me. Therefore, in order for justice to be done in that sense, in that framework of justice, because the external circumstances of the world were not the same for me and for the other person, we should try and, make up for that somehow.
We also, I think, ought to further narrow it in addition to excluding the individual circumstances of the victim. We ought to also make an effort to, I think, exclude the individual circumstance of the perpetrator himself. In other words, justice is purely focused around the individual action, not around the circumstances that surrounded that action, be it from the individual who the crime was committed against or the criminal himself. Otherwise, what we're going to likely start running into is a situation in which we justify a fundamentally evil behavior because, we think that person who committed that fundamentally evil behavior was so, say, downtrodden or victimized or whatever circumstances we want to attribute to that person. They did it, but we really ought to just kind of overlook it. So that's not justice either, right? We also have to differentiate justice in that sense.
So before we get into the distinction between intent and action, could we get into a better distinction between justice and fairness so that we're being fair to the conversation? So what exactly do we think fairness is if we're going to contrast it with justice? So Micah, you mentioned equity versus equality. Can you expound upon that a bit?
So yeah, so let's briefly touch. I think we all have an idea, pretty good idea of the difference between equity and equality. We've talked about it before. Just for the listeners, just very briefly, equity is what we might sometimes call equality of outcome. Equity is being is sameness, if you will. It's being in a having the same value, having the same access, having the same status, whether that be wealth, social, health, whatever, as another person. That's equity. Equality, at least in a more classical sense, is the idea that you have equal standing in the eyes of the law, and in particular equal opportunity to take such actions as you desire as other individuals who have not otherwise committed some sort of wrong. When we're talking about fairness, I think people have two different ideas of fairness. I think when you're a child, lots of kids, I certainly remember as a kid often uttering the phrase to my parents, "That's not fair," and frequently having my parents explain to me why something that I perceived as not fair, because I didn't see equality of outcome, was in fact fair because there was an equality of opportunity, and that there were other reasons for saying that something was fair, or even that something was not fair, and that sometimes life isn't fair. I guess what I'm dancing around here, the fact that everyone is going to approach the idea of fairness with a different definition. So in comparison to justice, I think we could say that fairness, at a minimum, is equality. At a maximum, it is equity. And we could say that equality and justice are not the same thing. Because if a tree falls on my house and not on Billy Joe Bob's house, that's not fair. It's not fair.
Yeah, but that's equality of outcome, not opportunity.
I want to make a differentiation here that I think will be useful.
Sure.
And that is the difference between kind of fairness in a societal sense and fairness in a sort of more cosmic sense. Because those are kind of two different things. So the debate around, for example, equality versus equity is a societally framed debate. That is the kind of when we talk about those things, we're meaning them primarily in the sense of are we going to under the law provide people with an equal opportunity, or are we under the law going to seek to as Josh might say, balance the scales and create a more equitable system in which people result in similar outcomes. That's different than a kind of cosmic idea of fairness, which I would argue doesn't actually exist. And that's an important thing to note, because the reality, and this is, in a certain sense, the whole conversation around fairness is a rather silly one, because the reality is that life is not fair. And it doesn't matter whether you strive to tyrannize people into the equality of their outcomes, or whether or not you give people a quote-unquote equal playing field, whatever that means. Which I think people mean that. They mean that we will not place societal barriers in their way that would prevent them from striving towards their goals. But the reality is that there's no such thing as an equal starting place or as an equal opportunity, right? I mean, one of the if there's the most well established, and the best example of this, I think, is IQ. IQ is the most well established of any of the social sciences. It's something you're born with. You can't change it. Well, you can change it in a very negative sense only through extreme circumstances. So if you bash your head into a brick wall repeatedly, you can damage your brain, and that will damage your IQ. But other than that, your IQ is set where it is, and you'll remain in that same position, in that same level of IQ for your entire life. And that is the single greatest indicator of long-term success in the workplace that we have, which means that you are either born with a brain that will allow you to be tremendously successful, or gives you the potential to be tremendously successful and make a very good income, or you're born with a brain that will not allow you to do that. If you're born with an IQ of 65, you'll never be literate. You'll never succeed in the workplace. You just won't. The United States military to this day, if you fall in the bottom 10th percentile of IQ, you can't join. That's 10% of all Americans, right? And the reasoning for that was that there was no job that the military could find for those individuals in which they would not be more of a liability than an asset. That's something you're born with. You can't change it.
So
there's no such thing as fairness. It doesn't exist.
Can I put forward a little bit of a summary of your ideas?
Yeah.
So what I'm gleaning from this is that the way in which societies can tend to try to enact justice in the form of fairness actually often results in injustice. And so
why?
We're speaking on the cosmic level. I'm going to explain. So justice is a balancing of the scales. Equality of opportunities, something along the lines of justice from what we've...
I want to get rid of that justice is a balancing of the scales thing, because I don't think that's true.
Maybe we're using it in different ways.
If you would... It does...
So,
it's no, I think Charlton makes a good point.
What you deserve for the individual action that you made. Yeah. I don't think that term balancing of the scales has a societal implication that I don't think you actually mean when you're saying that.
No, I'm trying to use it on the cosmic level, but
I know you're trying to use it on that scale, but I think that it muddies the waters.
You're right. It's very vague, and I could get into explaining that, but I'm just going to finish.
That has a societal implication based on the society.
I'll drop the term to finish making my point. Yeah. So, when a society or government tries to enact special benefits to people who are deemed to be further back on the starting line, so people with lower IQ, for instance, trying to give them benefits to push them ahead, then they are. It's an imbalancing of the scales. That's what I had in mind. That's why I'm using the term. But what other ways could we?
Because you're not rewarding action, right?
Right. You're not rewarding action. That's how I'm kind of using the term.
Yeah.
And conversely, if the government tries to place unnecessary barriers in front of people, such as, let's say, women or African Americans in before they were allowed to vote. That's an unnecessary barrier placed before them that does not allow them to have the same sort of equal opportunity as everyone else in society.
You could say that's an injustice, right?
That's my point.
You could say societal inequality of opportunity is an injustice.
Mm-hmm.
Societal equality of opportunity,
whether that's
justice.
from an action or an inaction on the part of the of society.
Right, because those things are necessarily tied together.
Let me ask you, what type of inaction could someone take that would be outside of gross negligence?
You might want to rephrase that. What kind of inaction could someone take? You might.
Yes.
You might want to rephrase that.
Let me rephrase that. That's a nonsense statement. What type of inaction? What kind of missed opportunity for action? Let's say that could someone miss or just commit? Again, it's a nonsense. It's hard to talk about. What's the sort of thing that someone could fail to do that would be a form of injustice, other than, we'll say, ruling out gross negligence? Okay, if a parent doesn't feed their child, that's gross negligence. Okay, that's an injustice. That's a duty that has been shirked. Maybe I'm answering my own question.
Maybe that's the best way to frame it, right? Yeah. If you fail to perform your basic duties as a human being, you could be doing an injustice, which we'd have to then define what the basic duties of being a human being are. But that's a good point, right?
Well, they're going to be circumstantial.
If you neglect your family, right, you failed as your role. Like if you're a husband and a father and you abandon your family, or even if you don't abandon them, you're just neglectful.
Yeah.
You just fail to do the best that you could do to provide for that family. I think you could rightfully call that an injustice.
And to back up that point, I don't think that if that wasn't true, we wouldn't think of the hero in a story as being someone who takes the call to action and fights the good fight. We were talking about stories a few weeks ago, and we were discussing how there's like the call to adventure for the hero in a story. And if he doesn't respond to that, if he fails to respond to that, he's shirking his duty. And so when he finally does respond to it, we all think he's heroic, he's victorious, and that's because he's fighting for justice.
Sort of going a slightly different direction than that. How does this then apply? If we're going to say that justice fundamentally requires, on the one hand, doing the things that you have a duty to do, which is going to be circumstantial person by person. If I don't have any children, I
do want to make a little specificity there.
Mm-hmm.
I rather than saying that justice is doing the things that you're supposed to do, rather that justice, right? We talked about justice being you get what you deserve for the action that you commit.
Mm.
So if you're doing the things that you're supposed to do, that is a good moral action.
Sure.
Which justice would necessarily reward. If you're doing things that you're not supposed to be doing by, say, shirking your responsibilities, shirking your duties, which is something that you're not supposed to do, is a bad moral action that you've just taken, even if it's an inaction. If you failed your duties, you've committed a moral wrong. Justice is you being punished for that.
Okay.
Right. So I want to make sure that we keep that in mind as we're. I want to be specific in the way that we're talking.
Sure, but you also said that justice is rewarding good moral action.
I think you could say that, although I'm a little. I think you could say that.
Okay.
Well, I would say you get what you deserve, right? So if good action deserves good reward, then that's true, right? So and I only in that sense do I mean that. Okay. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I almost am wondering if that's more like fairness, because well, here's the thing. If someone does a bad thing and they receive a good reward, then obviously we're going to say an injustice has occurred. But if someone does a good thing and they're not always going to receive beneficial results from that.
Right, but if I feed my kids, I have kids, and there's a there's a natural benefit that comes from having kids. Okay, there's a
so
natural
you
joy
have
that
to-
comes from
it's
that.
The
more
benefit
inherent to
itself is kind of ill-defined.
Well,
Right.
what I'm thinking is that
Situation.
the justice is inherent to the duty itself rather than to the results. Because you're not just doing
would
a
agree
good
with
thing
you.
so
Yeah.
that you get good results from it.
Attempting
Because
to
if
rob a bank is morally wrong, whether you actually succeed or not. You know, and there needs to be justice handed out for that, for what has been done.
And rescuing a child from a fire, like, that should be something that you should do. Doesn't matter if you're given a reward afterwards. Although we definitely wouldn't say injustice had been done if you are given a reward. And another person does the same thing and isn't given a reward. There's no injustice there.
Well, grace and justice are not mutually mutually exclusive. You can be gracious towards somebody. You can give someone a gift without destroying the nature of justice. Right? We would consider if somebody saved a child from a burning building, we would consider a reward a gift. We would not consider it a just recompense.
Yeah, exactly.
Would we?
Well,
Because to me,
we
a
certainly
gift is
wouldn't say that
unearned.
someone was owed
If
a
you've
reward.
done a good action and you've earned a reward for that action, that's not the same thing.
There's
as a
no
gift.
earned reward for doing something that you weren't I would
Required
say
to do.
You weren't legally compelled to do.
Well, no, but maybe, but not legally. I'm not talking in the legal sense. I'm talking in the moral sense, right? If you do something phenomenally good and you're rewarded for that, that's not a gift. A gift is arbitrary. A gift is random. You can give somebody a gift regardless of anything that they've done. They don't have to do anything to deserve a gift.
Right, but are you
It's different than
arguing
being
that
rewarded
you
for something good that you've done?
are you arguing that you should be compelled to receive a gift if you do this moral action?
No, not necessarily. I'm rather, and again, this is a little bit in kind of a gray area for me, because usually when we talk about justice, we're talking about it in the sense of you do something bad and you get punished for it.
Yes.
Mhm.
Whether or not it is, but to me, I mean, to me, there is that. To me, I have a hard time restricting it to just that. If you are, because you might say. And this is kind of where that idea, I kind of like what Mike was saying about the kids, right? This is where the idea of the reward gets a little bit iffy. Because if you say are a good father and a good husband, and you do good actions to create for yourself a good family, that the family itself, the result of your actions is its own reward, right? And now, and you would say, too, that if that person had gone through, had been a good father and a good husband, did everything that he was supposed to do, and his wife then went out and left him for no reason other than she just decided to,
Isn't that just
that would be an
unfairness?
injustice.
Isn't that
would be an
unfairness in the
No,
sense
I
you were
would consider
describing?
that an injustice.
Yeah, but earlier you were
I would-
discussing how bad things just happen in life and how life is.
Yeah, but that's not.
What's
that's
the
not
distinction?
the
Because I'm
same
not
thing.
seeing it.
Agency.
Well, the distinction is the action
Agency.
of another person.
Yes.
Agency. It's the action of another person, right? If another person acts in such a way that, or if you're a child, right? If you have a parent who's taken care of you, done everything that they could to provide for you and take care of you, and fulfilled all of their duties as a parent, and you go around and you're a good child, right? That's justice. You being a good child is the just result of their actions. If you're a bad child, you disregard them, you abandon them, you're ungrateful, like so many of us, our youth, are, that would be an injustice against that person, because they haven't deserved that. As Micah says, the key point there is agency.
Right.
So I do think that we have to keep that kind of, that positive, you have done good things, therefore you deserve, I'm not saying reward necessarily, because that's not really quite what because that's kind of a fungy term, but you don't deserve, if you have done good actions, and somebody pays that back with evil, that is injustice.
Okay, I will agree that is an injustice. But the thing
And you
that
might
I'm not,
rightfully say too, that if somebody has done something phenomenally good and they're rewarded for that, that it is just that they are rewarded for that. I do think that that's a legitimate statement.
yes, and that's
Here's a. Go ahead, Josh Smith.
I was gonna say. I do agree with that, and I think it it kind of brings us more of a positive view of justice. Although I'm not convinced that if a person does something good, that it would be unjust for them not to receive a reward.
I'm not saying it would be unjust for them not to receive a reward,
Right.
but it would be just that they would be.
Right.
And also, the idea that, often people are not rewarded for good actions, just as people are often not punished for bad actions, which is a separate thing. The kind of reality that justice is often not done in the real world is a separate thing from the idea that there is kind of a cosmic justice.
But that's
good actions ought to be rewarded, bad actions ought to be
Could we perhaps
punished,
argue
is
that
justice.
the fulfilling of the duty itself is reward enough?
Well, that's kind of what I was getting at with the idea
but
of
not
what is the
necessarily.
reward, right? If you
But-
are a good parent, good father, and you foster a good family for yourself, that is a reward.
But no, it's interesting, because if we're going to contend that on the one hand that someone does something good, purely good, if that were possible, someone does something good and is not rewarded, would we say that it is unjust? We can't say that it's unjust if they're not rewarded, and it's just if they are rewarded. Okay, we can say that justice has been unaffected if they're rewarded. But if we're going to say that on the one hand that it's just that someone is rewarded for doing good, if somebody is not rewarded for doing good, that would have to be an injustice. Just like frequently people do, like you said, frequently people do, are injustices committed that people are not punished for. So it's,
Right.
On one hand, there's a level of, justice is not absolute. Justice is not I got to be careful about what I mean when I say justice is not absolute. There's not necessarily, especially in a temporal sense, in terms of justice as experienced by humans in day-to-day interactions. Justice is not a definite quantity. Okay, there is no definite punishment for one particular, wrongdoing. There's no definite and absolute temporal punishment for that. There's no definite and absolute temporal reward for doing something good. Do we agree
Right.
with that?
I do think, yeah, I think if you flip it around like that, it starts to make things much clearer, right? Because as you say, to me it doesn't make much sense to differentiate between kind of justice applying to good actions versus justice applying to bad actions. If you would absolutely consider it an injustice if somebody did something bad and was not punished for it. And so to me, it doesn't make very much sense to then flip that around and say that if somebody does something good and isn't rewarded for that in some kind of way, that is not also injustice.
Well, that means that justice does not apply equally to both good and bad actions.
Well, exactly, right? So you would have to consider it in both ways in order for it to be logically consistent. Now there's a big, as you also just said, I think there's a big gray. I don't even want to say gray area, but there's a debate to be had about what the reward or what the punishment looks like for the individual action. And I think that's kind of where Josh was centered around, because there is a lot of, and I'm not saying that there's a kind of there may very well, and I would be a believer that there is a kind of cosmic absolute justice, right? That's different than the sense of us as, on a societal level, we're trying to decide how it is to dish out punishments and rewards. There is a lot of debate in there, in our own society and across, all of human history, really, all societies throughout all of human history, as to what specifically that looks like, and what those punishments, what those rewards actually ought to look like. What's a fair punishment and reward, which is where that idea of fairness might actually come into play.
Balancing of scales.
and that's a real debate that could be had.
Right.
But that's kind of a separate idea than the idea of kind of justice in the cosmic sense. And that's kind of why I wanted to focus on this justice in the sort of cosmic sense of the word at the beginning. Because the debate around the specifics of what actually are the appropriate punishments and rewards for various actions is a much, much, much heavier debate. And there's a lot of weeds in that. And we could spend... You could write books about books and books and books about that.
Right.
And so narrowing the conversation to it in kind of the more cosmic sense of the word makes it a little bit more manageable.
And maybe you could argue that the political enforcement is more along the lines of fairness, whereas the individual's relation to actual moral action would be more justice.
Right, because people are going to have very different ideas as far as the specifics of a punishment or a reward. Particular action.
Yeah.
Based on that perception of that idea.
So to be clear, we are kind of writing off the whole social justice.
That's not even a topic.
Social contract, even just for the sake of
that would be another
argument.
Conversation.
Yeah,
I think.
And social contract is another conversation too.
Right, but that's kind of written off for the sake of this argument.
For the sake of this, I think we have to narrow it. That's why I was trying to narrow it to the cosmic sense. Because if we try to delve into that, it's a whole other beast.
Well, then let's address something in the cosmic sense that we haven't yet, which is if justice, and I think we've been assuming so far for the purpose of this conversation that justice is something sort of. We've been using the term cosmic justice. We've been using the term moral justice. We can try and define what that is. But we also need to ask the question of why it is. Why is there an idea of moral or cosmic justice? Why is there a problem that needs to be corrected by justice?
Okay.
Specifically.
So that's a great question, but can we finish up the little thing we were on first?
Oh, sure.
Josh specifically had brought up the distinction between intent and action when it came to moral injustice, and we were seeming to be applying the same thing to moral justice. So where is the justice primarily to be found?
What do you mean? What do you mean when you're distinguishing justice and injustice?
So when it came to the example of someone mugging you, for instance, the moral injustice is in the action that the person takes, right? But then we got into the argument of, okay, well, what if there's reasons for this? What if this person's a schizophrenic? What if
I think that's kind of where that issue I think we kind of already talked about that, right? That's kind of where that issue of fairness comes into play, and that's more of a societal concern, which again to me is it's just that's not a legitimate point to me. That's just outside the scope of this conversation.
You think
that's almost a separate conversation.
I was looking at it more from the moral angle. So if you're someone who has schizophrenia or who is trying to steal back someone else's money that was stolen from them in the first place, then there's a difference between that and someone who just wants to make some personal profit and goes and mugs someone. And I'm not looking at that in the legal sense. I'm looking at that in the moral sense.
Well, right. I mean, obviously, so in schizophrenia, for example, if you lack moral agency, if you commit an action, but you're sick, and you've done something that is outside of your, say, individual moral agency, you can't really punish that and call it justice because there's no moral action that took place. In the same frame, you could talk about somebody, and really you can talk about vigilantism and whether or not somebody ought to be doing that. But the idea that somebody is wronged and therefore takes an action to right that wrong on their own, that again tends to me to fall more in that realm of the society, whether or not something like vigilantism is okay. And we could talk about that, but that to me is kind of a separate thing as well.
You have just made a claim there that justice, in terms of action, is directly tied to intent in some way.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
And the interesting thing is, if you have somebody who's sick and commits what we would consider to be a moral wrong, they at the very least they commit an injury against another person. That is, somebody has to be responsible for that, because
I'm
an
not
injury
saying,
has
I'm not
been.
saying intent. Can we not say intent? Could we say rather agency?
Sure,
in that particular
let's say agency.
situation?
If
Because that person doesn't have agency.
so,
They didn't
if they don't have agency, do they just become a part of the environment, effectively?
Kind of, yeah. It becomes more on par of like a natural disaster than an individual wronging you. Because they don't know what they're doing. If you have Tourette's and you go around like cursing at everybody, like that's not your fault. You can't control that. You can't like rightfully look at that person and say, okay, bad, give him a slap. Like you can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some
they didn't
obviously
choose
some
to do
more
that.
complicated examples. Like if I get pulled over, I got a bottle of Jack Daniels in my hand, and the officer's like, "What are you doing? You're swerving all over the place. You're hitting street signs." I'm like, "Sorry, officer, it wasn't me. It was the alcohol." So.
Well, but you took a voluntary action to get yourself into that place.
Okay, no,
right?
I didn't. Someone
That's
else
a different...
got me drunk and then put me in the behind the
well,
steering wheel.
that's not really what we're talking about here. But that you took
just
the idea.
This conversation is so complicated. Is kind of the point.
It is, but I think it comes down to that idea of you took a voluntary action to put yourself in that situation. That's a different thing than, again, somebody who was born with a mental issue that results in them doing something that they can't control, that they would never voluntarily do. And you know, but again, this is where we get down into the weeds, right? Because this is like, we could go through every example in the book on that and talk about each one, but like, we could spend hours just talking about that, which is trying to draw the conversation back
I think we
bit.
firmly established that agency is required for justice.
Absolutely.
For a just or unjust action to occur.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not in the action itself, it's in the agency.
Which is a...
Well, it's in both. You have to have both.
Well, yes. I was kind of contrasting the two as just the action itself in like an objective sense.
Well, if you have agency but there's no action, there's no justice one way or another, right? It has to be... You have
right. That's what I meant.
In order to assume justice, what we've established is in order to assume that justice can be done, we must assume that there must have been some sort of agency in the first place that caused the injustice that is to be corrected.
If I'm driving a car and I hit a patch of ice and I like go into a donut and I run into another car and kill a guy, that's not the same thing as me like voluntarily taking my car and charging it into a pedestrian.
Right. No, but you could have been operating the vehicle dangerously given the conditions.
Yeah, but that's a separate. If I'm operating it completely fine and you know I just happen to hit a patch of ice and I lose control of my car, you know. So again, you kind of get it gets dicey to get down to the specifics.
It's almost like a spectrum in that
general
sense.
We're talking about it in a moral sense, right? In general, a bad action requires you had to actually take that bad action. It had to be something you had agency in. You actually had to do it, right? You like voluntarily do it. You can't just like accidentally, through no faults of your own, do something bad that you weren't supposed to do, that you had no way of controlling, and then, you know, okay, well we're gonna punish somebody for that. Like, you know, that's not really justice. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about justice. Not in the cosmic sense. So, you know,
which is an important distinction.
Anyway, I do want to get back to. I do want to go into what Micah, could you repeat what you were...
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about what justice is and how we define it, but we haven't talked anything about why it exists or why it's even necessary. We seem to just be kind of assuming that so far. So rather than just trying to define justice, let's ask the question of why is justice required? You know, a lot of people these days are of the mindset that, you know, everything is... You know, they think we'd be silly for claiming that agency is a thing, is that agency even exists. You know, there's a lot of deterministic materialists out there, or you know, people who believe that, you know, ultimately you have no control over your reality. You're just, you know, an assembly of atoms in a body. What are some arguments for having any system of We've not been talking about a system of justice. We've just been talking about morality.
This is going to be my
Sure.
silly cop-out answer, but just as we talk about morality itself, and justice is obviously dependent. The idea of justice is obviously dependent on the idea of an objective morality. Neither of those things are justifiable absent the existence of God and the belief in that. And so if we talk about where it is we derive our ideas of justice in the cosmic sense, you cannot have a logically consistent conception of the idea of a cosmic sense of justice without the existence of God, without that belief. And that's my cop-out answer to that.
Why do you think that the existence of God is necessary for a belief in justice?
For the same reason that I think that the idea of the existence of God is necessary for the notion of a sort of objective morality, because and for the same reason that the king of the nihilists, Friedrich Nietzsche, would have said that with the death of God comes a loss of all of those things, because as he understood, when you remove the absolute, the sense of the absolute, which is what God is, the absolute's gone. There's no objective morality. There's no objective justice. You can't have that things because there's no such thing as absolute. If you're a nihilist, if you're a materialist, there is no absolute. You can't claim any kind of sense of an absolute morality, and so of course you can't claim any kind of sense of absolute justice, because that's predicated on the idea of an absolute morality, that there actually are good and bad actions.
Well,
and that only exists with God.
Well, and I guess the area I'm going to challenge in, I obviously I totally agree with you. I think you know that. To play devil's advocate, why exactly is God required for the idea of an absolute? Can't we have an absolute without God?
So how about this? How does the belief in God justify the absolute?
Yes, that would be another way of phrasing the question. Or why is there not an alternative? Would be another side of it.
I mean, he did just kind of make that point with Nietzsche, but kind of beyond that.
Well,
like,
he said
argument?
You said that without God, you remove the absolute, and then there is no absolute left. But you did not. I mean, certainly, I'm not going to ask you to disprove a negative here. I'm not going to ask you to prove to me that there is no alternative besides God to have some sort of idea of an absolute, because you could get into the weeds on that one. We could make a good argument for it, but you're going to have to get into the weeds. Why is it that once you remove God, you remove the possibility for an absolute, though? Do you have any way to elaborate on that?
Well, I guess you are asking me to disprove a negative, right? So I guess,
and I'm not necessarily asking you for proof for that. I want to get more out of it. Like, I want to understand.
But I guess here's the issue, right? There is no alternative. That's fundamentally the issue. There is no other justification that has ever been provided by anyone anywhere, and the best minds that have existed in humankind have dedicated their lives to trying to find an answer to that question, right? This is Jung's whole idea, right? Nietzsche's fundamental problem is exactly this problem. God is dead. How the hell do we find any sense of objective truth, objective morality, objective good without the existence of God? Nietzsche never finds an answer to that. Jung takes over for him, does his best, ends up at something approximating biblical Christianity, because as it turns out, there actually is no alternative. All roads lead back to that. I would say that if you think you have an alternative, I would love to hear it, because it would be an awfully convenient truth if God didn't exist and we could all just do whatever we wanted and choose our own moralities and still have an objectively meaningful and just world. But that's actually not the reality, and no one has ever provided a viable alternative.
How about, okay, so would we be able to maybe point out some of the alternative justifications for
point them out. I'll happily tear them down.
Well, not to tear them down, just to more explore what the different.
Yeah, but that's the way you do it, right? What are all the alternatives, and why are they all wrong?
Well, the first
because that's what it comes down to.
The first one that comes to my mind is almost a utilitarian, like
That's what I was thinking of.
what the individual finds the highest level of pleasure in doing, like individual liberty.
That's not an absolute
personal
morality, though.
Right, no, but you, no matter what framework you work within, you still are going to have to develop a theory of justice.
Yes, but will you develop a theory of moral justice?
Without God, why would you have to develop an idea of justice if there's no God and no objective truth?
Well, I mean, you could think about it sort of like the Greeks did a little bit. You could think about it from the sense of the idea that there's some sort of truth to the universe that is beyond everyone, which of course gets very close to.
Wait, hold on. I thought we weren't supposed to be using God.
No, I was going to say that gets very, very close to the idea of God.
It's
not quite the
same.
same.
You're saying that, okay, well, my alternative to God is that there's an objective reality outside of the universe that we can't see.
Well, we can't even talk about without whether moral justice exists without assuming some sort of objective morality.
Where does that come from?
Well, and that's my point. And
right?
maybe that's not the conversation we're having. Maybe we just need
statement in belief in God is statement in belief in objective morality.
So maybe then, rather than having the conversation about whether objective morality exists and whether God exists and what are the alternative arguments to God, because I think that's a really good topic that we could get into more as a specific topic at a different time. Maybe rather than doing that, we should accept just a mild presupposition here that we've already been working within the framework of some sort of objective morality. Why is justice necessary within a framework of objective morality? What purpose does it serve? Maybe we've already answered that question.
Well, you could say that if there is such a thing as objective morality, that justice is actually one of the objective morals. That justice is objectively good in that framework. In other words, those two things aren't actually separate.
How about this is the way I think of it. Embodying an abstract in a concrete action. So that the abstract is the objective moral system, and the justice is the concrete enacting of it, whether through a good action or a bad action.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, is can you even have a system of morality without a system of justice? Does it even mean anything? To say that one thing is right and another thing is wrong if there's no consequences for that, you know.
Well, in the definition I just provided, I think they kind of go hand in hand. It's not like you can have one without the other. They're two different components that, perhaps with other things, comprise a whole when it comes to morality.
I don't think that you can quite discount in the absence of actuated justice, discount the idea of an objective morality. In other words, if somebody does something wrong and they're not caught, they're not punished, that doesn't change the fact that they did something wrong. And I don't think that, and it does deserve to be punished.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that justice won't be done. In a cosmic moral sense,
right? And so that's kind of where I come back.
Wrong, you're still going to be punished. Let me put it this way: you're still going to receive just recompense for the things that you have done.
And that's where I kind of come back to that idea of cosmic justice versus kind of societal justice, right? And so I think that kind of circles back to that particular differentiation.
It kind of reiterates the point that we made earlier that, and I mean, I'm not sure to what extent we made this explicitly, but if you commit an evil deed, the commission of the deed itself will be the punishment in a sense, even if no action is brought against you for having done it. The same thing with a good deed. If you do a good deed, you may not receive a tangible reward for doing so, but the good deed itself is kind of the reward for doing it.
So you could rightfully, in that case, Mike, I think, say that societal justice is disconnected in a major sense.
But that's not what we're talking about.
But I'm getting back to what you just said, right? Right. We're talking about. But so what because you're talking about, is justice separated? If it's not enacted, is it therefore discount the idea of objective morality? And my answer to that would be no. That societal, because what you're talking about there is actually societal justice.
No, it's not.
If societal justice is not, but what we just, I think what we just rightfully determined is that cosmic justice actually can't be separated from objective morality.
Yeah, which is what I was. I'm sorry. That's what I was trying to sort of ask.
Right.
Can that be separated? I honestly was not thinking about it in terms of, at least not necessarily in terms of everyday consequences for your actions. I mean, I think it could be said that justice and morality should not be separated as ideas too much, because then you're right, they can't really function without one another. In a more, and when we're talking about justice and morality, we're not talking about justice and consequences. We're talking about, well, maybe that's not what I mean to say. I don't know.
Well, if we tie this back to God, to Christianity, right? Why couldn't God just forgive everybody? Why did Jesus have to come and die for everybody? Right? If God is all powerful, he should have just been able to forgive everybody. He should have just decided not to enact justice. But there's this idea that God is the absolute. God is the ultimate objective, absolute moral value. And justice is intrinsically tied to that. God actually can't just forgive everybody. Because justice and objective morality aren't separatable. Justice had to be done. Now, God is also infinitely merciful. And so there was only ever one way to save anybody, right? Which is exactly what happened on the cross. That was the only way that could have been done. And that's why, people say, well, why couldn't God just forgive everybody? It's like, that's why. God couldn't just forgive anybody. He actually couldn't do it. There had to be justice. In order for God to fulfill his own self, there had to be justice. And justice was done.
In what way is it just for someone to receive punishment for an action that they did not commit?
I don't know.
That's a great question.
Because that's the implication of what you have just said.
The implication is exactly that, right? The implication is that that there actually could be a sacrifice, that somebody blameless could actually bear the weight of somebody else's guilt.
I mean, that
would be actually moral.
There's certainly, looking at this again from a really Christian perspective, there's certainly pretense for that. There's certainly what's the legal term? Precedence. There's precedence for that in Scripture, certainly. That idea of the covering of sins by offering something up.
And we do that in our own legal system, right? Instead of me killing somebody because they did something wrong, we allow them to sacrifice something, pay a fine. Instead of living out instead of sacrificing your life and living out a prison sentence and all of that stuff, pay a fine and we'll let you go. You get to sacrifice something for something else. Justice is still being done. There's still a sacrifice involved with that. But instead of paying with your own life, you're paying with something else.
Paying with something of
value. Of value.
And what's interesting is in a certain sense of looking at things, Christ sacrificed himself. But in another way of looking at things, we sacrificed Christ. And we sacrificed something of infinite value. That doesn't make what we did right, but it is, in a certain sense, the payment of the debt.
Well, and there were echoes of that all throughout Scripture, with the sacrifices in the Old Covenant always being the sacrifice of the spotless lamb.
Right.
And so with Christ, it's the divine truth, the absolute, embodied in a human person. And he lives a blameless life. He commits no injustice. And only because he committed no injustices was he able to die and take everyone else's sins upon him. Did I say something confusing?
No,
it's just something worth pondering, you know?
Yeah.
It's still not entirely apparent to me how that works.
I think it. Again, you'd have to go back, and this is a mystery, I think, right?
Yes, I agree.
The objective morality is beyond our comprehension. God is beyond our comprehension. It's up to Him to decide what's right and wrong.
But then, Josh, if this is really the case, and this is really what Christianity believes, and if this is just such a mystery, and if Christianity's reconciliation of the injustices of the world with the things that people have done is something that I cannot comprehend, should I not just toss the whole system?
Well, you can. But I guess we'll see where it leads you.
Right.
And that would be my challenge.
And that's
doing
what I'm getting at.
Try it.
Wow. Try it.
See where it leads you.
Just try it, Micah.
Yeah.
Do it.
No, but that is my challenge.
No,
that anyone who says that's my challenge. Live like that for a month. Really live like that for a month.
Yeah.
Like there is no objective morality. Like your actions don't have meaning. Live for a month like God doesn't exist. Really live that way. And see where that leads you.
See if you're able to live for a month.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That would be my challenge. But find the alternative. Show me, demonstrate to me your alternative. In actuality, lived out, truly.
Consistently.
Makes you then ask the question, we are still talking about justice, but, it then makes you ask the question, is anyone actually living that way?
No.
And that's the thing. Nobody is.
No one.
Everyone's acting on some level. Unless they are a completely sick, insane, crazy person, in which case, as we've already established, they're not really acting. Everyone is acting like there is an objective morality that exists.
I've always said I don't believe in nihilists. I've always said I don't believe in nihilists. Everyone's a theist. Just depends on who your God is.
Hmm. Well, do we have anything more to add to the discussion about justice here? Or just to the general topic of God and Christianity that we've ended up on, inevitably.
You can't have a conversation without justice without ending up there.
Oh, of course not.
I think it definitely gave me some things to think about that I haven't thought through enough.
To not, pardon me for the sort of, I don't know if it's a pun, but to not end up on this topic during a discussion about justice would be to do the topic injustice. Okay, come on, Charlton. They can't hear your face. They can't hear the cringe on your face when I said that.
I saw it coming. I knew it was coming. I was just like preparing myself for it. Well done. I can respect that.
Micah, you have done this entire podcast.
Yep, just right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Micah, as always, that was an extremely adequate pun.
Yeah, it doesn't do justice to the adequacy of my puns.
You know,
He's
nothing would ever do
He's
justice
acceptable.
to how adequate your puns are.
He's not adequate. He's acceptable.
Acceptable and
He's
adequate.
what's
really the difference
I'm
between
sorry.
adequate and acceptable?
I feel like
That's a
adequate
whole
is
other
slightly
debate.
better than.
we can do a mini podcast on that. But maybe we could talk about that. One of the things that we're going to be doing sometime in the future is what we're going to call Stooge Day, which is just when we're going to sit down and talk about whatever we want. So we could talk about what the difference between adequacy and acceptability is. We could talk about whether water is wet, although we've already had that discure.
We did. Well, we already have the whole thing recorded. We can post that one anytime we want.
And someday when we get lots of followers and we're really popular and people might actually want to listen to it.
We're not going to post that one.
Maybe we can post.
Yeah, we
it.
have to.
I'm
We
still
have to.
majorly butthurt by it.
Smith.
Yeah, I know. I won that debate.
Charlton and
Josh is hurt.
Smith got into it really bad, and Charlton looked like he was creaming Smith, and I'm just sitting there like trying to get them to talk to each other because
It was
they both
pretty
misunderstood
fun.
what each other was saying.
I
It
was
a
having a
mess.
good time.
Pretty dumb.
Charlton was having a great time misunderstanding Josh. Smith was having a terrible time misunderstanding Charlton.
No, we were both. We were not even having the same debate. That was what was so
That's
bad.
true. Honestly,
We
that's-
were.
you guys
You were
weren't
just
having the
losing
same
it.
debate.
It was a lot of fun.
Anyway,
I do really legitimately want to have a podcast episode where Josh tries to convince me that I don't exist.
okay.
I really want to have, but we have to have a lot of it. Like that should be one that we actually do together in person and with a lot of alcohol.
Well, mind you, this is going to be posted on the internet, so we do
So
need to be
what?
careful
Who
about that,
cares?
but-
It'll be a lot of
I'm
fun.
I'm right there with you,
Oh,
Josh.
man. No, I agree. We need to.
You're outvoted, Micah.
We need to do some special topics whenever we're all together in person. So, but unless anybody has anything to end to the topic of justice, I think we'll end the podcast right there. So, thank you guys. You've been listening to another Philosophical Tuesday, a production of the Intellectual Stooges. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday for another episode.